I've never felt anything like this in my life, obviously. Oh my, dreaming completely. Thank you everyone that voted for me.
Have you ever watched someone sing on stage, their voice giving you chills, even bringing judges to tears? But later learned that behind all the applause was a painful story you never knew? Can a massive stage like America's Got Talent truly bring happiness? Or does it sometimes hide wounds we can't see? This is the heartbreaking true story of Sydnie Christmas that America's Got Talent didn't tell you. Sydnie's story isn't just about a powerful audition or viral fame. It's about a young woman with extraordinary dreams, a battle against insecurity, the crushing weight of public expectation, and tragedies that remind us fame often hides shadows the cameras never capture. From her tough beginnings, her golden voice that stunned the world, to the dark side of her journey rarely revealed, this is a story that will inspire you and break your heart at the same time. Before we dive into the full story, make sure you hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more emotional and eye-opening stories from the entertainment world. Reporters who later pieced together the early life of Sydnie Christmas discovered a childhood marked by hardship, resilience, and an early discovery of music as both an escape and a lifeline. Born in Kent to a working-class family, Sydnie grew up in a modest environment where financial constraints were constant and opportunities were scarce. Yet despite the lack of material wealth, her family always sought to nurture her love of singing. Teachers recalled her as a bright but sometimes withdrawn student, one who seemed to shine only when performing in school assemblies or community plays, while classmates remembered her as a target of teasing and bullying, especially when she openly expressed her dream of one day becoming a singer. Journalists noted that these experiences carved deep insecurities into her, yet also gave her the determination to prove her doubters wrong. Family friends told the press that Sydnie could often be heard singing around the house for hours on end, using her bedroom as a stage and her reflection in the mirror as her first audience, a habit that revealed both her passion and her need to create a world where she could feel safe. Her parents, though struggling to make ends meet, scraped together enough to pay for occasional singing lessons, and her commitment to honing her craft became evident early on as she practiced tirelessly, sometimes even busking or performing at small events to gain experience. Reporters concluded that Sydnie's childhood, though filled with obstacles, forged the foundation of the woman who would later captivate millions. Someone who knew pain intimately, who understood exclusion, but who had already learned to transform adversity into art long before the world came to know her name. As journalists traced Sydnie Christmas's journey toward stardom, they emphasized that music was never merely a pastime for her but rather the very essence of her identity and the shield she used to protect herself from the harshness of the world. Friends and mentors told reporters that whenever Sydnie felt isolated, anxious, or overwhelmed by the cruelty of her peers, she would retreat into singing, pouring her emotions into melodies that gave voice to feelings she struggled to articulate otherwise. Inspired by powerful vocalists like Whitney Houston and Adele, Sydnie learned early on that songs could carry truths too heavy for spoken words, and in them she found both strength and release. Journalists highlighted how her persistence stood out even in her teenage years. While other young people were distracted by fleeting interests, Sydnie dedicated every spare moment to rehearsals, recording herself on cheap devices, and refining her style until she could feel her confidence building with every note. Music became her therapy, a place where she could be vulnerable without fear of ridicule, and gradually it transformed into her armor, the one thing no bully or doubter could take away from her. Reporters noted that she carried this duality into every performance. The shy, uncertain young woman who offstage often second-guessed herself, and the commanding, soulful singer who seemed untouchable once the first note left her lips. Friends confided that Sydnie often said she felt most alive when she was singing, that in those moments she wasn't just performing but surviving, reclaiming a part of herself that the world had tried to diminish. For journalists covering her rise, this relationship with music was crucial to understanding why Sydnie's performances resonated so powerfully, because they weren't just technical displays of talent but lived experiences channeled into song, each note carrying the weight of her personal battles and each lyric echoing her determination to be seen and heard for who she truly was. Reporters who later chronicled Sydnie Christmas's journey to America's Got Talent described it as a story shaped by hesitation, resilience, and the quiet courage of a young woman who had long dreamed of a bigger stage but doubted whether the world was ready to accept her. Friends and mentors interviewed by journalists revealed that Sydnie had been encouraged to audition for years, yet she often held herself back, haunted by memories of past rejections at smaller competitions where casting directors dismissed her appearance or told her that her style wasn't commercial enough. Those experiences reinforced her insecurities and left her wondering whether she could withstand the scrutiny of a televised competition where millions would be watching. But according to sources close to her, a series of successful local performances gradually restored her faith in her own abilities, with audiences often brought to tears by the sincerity of her voice, and these moments became the spark that reignited her courage. Reporters noted that Sydnie spent months preparing for her audition, rehearsing tirelessly in front of friends, working late into the night on song choices, and imagining how she could connect with the judges on an emotional level rather than simply delivering a technically strong performance. The decision to apply was not simply about fame or fortune but about reclaiming the confidence she had lost and proving, most of all to herself, that her voice deserved to be heard on the grandest stage possible. On the day of her audition, journalists described how Sydnie walked onto the AGT stage with visible nerves, her hands trembling as she introduced herself, yet beneath the anxiety lay a determination years in the making. For reporters, this moment symbolized far more than just another contestant's shot at stardom. It was the culmination of a lifetime of quiet battles and the beginning of a story that would soon capture global attention. When Sydnie Christmas finally performed before the judges of America's Got Talent, reporters present that night described the atmosphere as electric, a mixture of skepticism and anticipation that often accompanies unknown contestants. Dressed modestly and without any theatrical gimmicks, Sydnie seemed like an unlikely candidate to deliver one of the most unforgettable performances of the season, but as soon as she began to sing, the room shifted. Journalists detailed how her voice, raw yet controlled, filled the auditorium with a richness that silenced the crowd, transforming their initial doubt into awe within seconds. The judges, too, were visibly moved. Simon Cowell, usually the most stoic, leaned forward in rare admiration, while Sofia Vergara clasped her hands together and Heidi Klum wiped away tears as Sydnie's performance reached its crescendo. By the time the final note rang out, the audience was on its feet in a thunderous standing ovation, and the judges' praise poured in, with some calling it one of the most emotional auditions they had ever witnessed. Reporters highlighted how this audition didn't just showcase Sydnie's technical ability but her capacity to connect emotionally, to turn her personal struggles into a performance that felt universally relatable. Within hours, clips of her audition spread across social media, garnering millions of views and headlines proclaiming her as the breakout star of the season. Yet journalists also observed a subtle detail in Sydnie's demeanor backstage. Behind her relieved smile and grateful words, there remained a flicker of disbelief, as though she herself couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. For the world, it was a triumphant moment that introduced a new star. But for reporters closely following her story, it was also the beginning of immense pressures that would test her in ways no one could have predicted. Reporters covering Sydnie Christmas in the aftermath of her viral audition noted that while the performance propelled her into the spotlight and won her millions of admirers, it also thrust her into a whirlwind of sudden fame and unrelenting pressure that she was unprepared for. Within days, her name dominated entertainment headlines, her face appeared across social media platforms, and journalists clamored for interviews, eager to present her as the season's breakout sensation. While the public narrative celebrated Sydnie as a symbol of authenticity and resilience, reporters discovered that behind the smiles and polite soundbites, she was overwhelmed by the intensity of her new reality. Friends confided to the press that Sydnie often stayed up late scrolling through online comments, savoring the praise but agonizing over the criticism that inevitably followed. Remarks about her appearance, doubts about her longevity, or harsh comparisons to past contestants. Reporters described this as a double-edged sword. On one hand, she was living the dream she had chased for years, but on the other, she was subjected to a relentless cycle of judgment that magnified her insecurities. Media analysts noted how quickly the narrative shifted from celebrating her audition to speculating whether she could sustain the momentum, placing immense pressure on Sydnie to deliver perfection every time she appeared. Journalists observed that the very qualities that had endeared her to the public, her vulnerability, her emotional transparency, also left her particularly exposed to the brutality of fame. Each interview, each performance rehearsal, each public outing became another opportunity for scrutiny, and while she continued to express gratitude publicly, those close to her told reporters that she felt the weight of expectation like a constant shadow. For Sydnie, sudden fame was exhilarating but also suffocating, and reporters concluded that this chapter of her journey revealed the dangerous gap between how easily the world crowns its stars and how little it considers the toll such adoration takes on the human being at the center of it all. As the media frenzy around Sydnie Christmas grew, reporters who sought to understand the person behind the performances uncovered a far more fragile reality than the polished image presented on stage. Despite the acclaim and opportunities pouring in, Sydnie struggled privately with the immense contrast between her public persona and her inner life, a duality that left her feeling increasingly isolated. Friends and acquaintances interviewed by journalists revealed that Sydnie often retreated into solitude, confiding that she worried about being exposed as an imposter, someone who wasn't truly as extraordinary as the headlines claimed. Reporters highlighted that she carried with her the scars of past bullying and rejection, and though the standing ovations seemed to erase them in public memory, they continued to haunt her in private moments. Behind the bright lights, she dealt with anxiety, bouts of self-doubt, and the exhaustion of trying to maintain an image of unwavering strength. Journalists pieced together stories from insiders who described Sydnie as someone who gave her all on stage, singing with a force that seemed unstoppable, only to collapse into tears or silence once the cameras were off. The pressure to constantly embody the role of the inspiring underdog left her little room to simply exist as herself, to be vulnerable without fear of judgment. Reporters also noted that despite her rising fame, Sydnie's financial and personal struggles had not magically disappeared, and she often confided that the gap between people's perception of her glamorous life and the reality she lived felt suffocating. For journalists, this fragile life behind the spotlight painted a sobering picture, that even in triumph, Sydnie was fighting invisible battles, and that the applause which lifted her career could not silence the doubts and fears that followed her home. It was this hidden reality, reporters concluded, that made her story both inspiring and tragic, a reminder that behind every headline and viral clip is a human being grappling with complexities the public rarely sees. Reporters who later revisited Sydnie Christmas's journey wrote with a heavy tone when describing the period that came to be seen as her lowest point, a time when the pressures of fame, the lingering wounds of her past, and the relentless scrutiny of the public collided in ways that left her deeply vulnerable. Sources close to Sydnie told journalists that while she had achieved what seemed like a dream come true, standing ovations, headlines proclaiming her as the new star of America's Got Talent, she often confessed privately that she felt unworthy of the love and attention being directed her way. The cycle of rehearsing, performing, and appearing in media spots began to take a toll, leaving her physically and emotionally drained, and those who knew her said she sometimes described herself as being trapped in a role she could not escape. Reporters documented how late-night social media posts hinted at her struggles, cryptic messages about exhaustion, loneliness, and the fear of disappointing those who believed in her. In interviews, while her smile never faltered, journalists noted a weariness in her eyes that suggested the internal battles she carried everywhere she went. At this stage, Sydnie became more withdrawn, canceling appearances and declining invitations, behaviors that worried those around her but were often overlooked by a public still intoxicated by the memory of her triumphant audition. Reporters who pieced together this chapter concluded that the very success Sydnie had longed for seemed to amplify her insecurities instead of healing them, and that her lowest point was not a result of weakness but the cumulative effect of years of struggle compounded by sudden, overwhelming visibility. For journalists, this period served as a devastating reminder of how easily society can celebrate someone in the spotlight while missing the silent cries for help happening just out of view, and in Sydnie's case, the cost of that oversight was heartbreakingly clear. In the wake of Sydnie Christmas's lowest moments and the tragedy that followed, reporters documented an enormous public and media reaction that reflected both admiration for her talent and regret for how her story had unfolded. Social media was flooded with clips of her audition and performances, many reposted with captions expressing disbelief and sorrow that someone who seemed so radiant could have been hiding so much pain. Fans wrote long tributes, recalling how Sydnie's voice had inspired them, how her courage to be vulnerable on stage gave them strength, and how they wished they had known more about what she was going through. Journalists noted that media outlets, which had once been quick to spotlight her quirks or amplify criticism, shifted their tone dramatically, publishing somber retrospectives that framed her as a symbol of both brilliance and fragility. Judges and fellow contestants gave interviews expressing shock and heartbreak, some admitting that in hindsight they had seen glimpses of her struggles but never realized how serious they were. Reporters emphasized the irony that it often takes tragedy for the public to acknowledge the humanity of performers, and in Sydnie's case, the reaction revealed a deep collective guilt, as though audiences and media alike had failed to look past the glitter of the stage to the person beneath. Analysts pointed out that Sydnie's story sparked broader conversations about mental health in the entertainment industry, about the dangers of sudden fame without proper support, and about the responsibility of media to treat young stars with empathy rather than exploitation. Fans around the world united in grief, their posts a mix of mourning and a call for change. and reporters concluded that the public and media reaction, though heartfelt, also underscored the tragedy of a system that often sees too late what could have been prevented. For many, Sydnie's legacy was not only her extraordinary voice but also the painful reminder that applause can mask suffering, and that compassion must come before spectacle. Reporters reflecting on the arc of Sydnie Christmas's life emphasized that her story offers painful yet necessary lessons about the intersection of talent, fame, and human vulnerability, lessons that resonate not only within the entertainment industry but across society as a whole. In numerous articles and broadcasts following her tragedy, journalists noted that Sydnie's journey demonstrated how quickly the machinery of fame can elevate an ordinary individual into a global sensation while simultaneously stripping away the support systems that person needs to survive such scrutiny. Her life became a case study in the importance of mental health awareness, with advocates pointing out that Sydnie's struggles mirrored those of countless performers who are expected to embody perfection while quietly battling insecurities and exhaustion behind closed doors. Reporters highlighted how her courage to perform with raw vulnerability was celebrated on stage, yet those same vulnerabilities left her exposed when the cameras stopped rolling, and the lesson to be drawn is that authenticity must be met with compassion, not exploitation. Analysts interviewed in the wake of her story stressed that television talent shows, while designed to entertain, must also recognize their responsibility toward the human beings whose lives they catapult into the spotlight, ensuring that fame is not handed out without guidance, protection, and care. For fans, Sydnie's journey was a reminder to look beyond the viral moments, to recognize that behind every performance is a person carrying unseen burdens, and to extend empathy not only to celebrities but to the people in their own lives who may be fighting silent battles. Reporters concluded that the enduring lesson from Sydnie's story is that applause, no matter how thunderous, cannot replace kindness, and that if society truly values the art that performers create, it must also value the lives and well-being of the performers themselves. In their closing analyses of Sydnie Christmas's impact, reporters consistently emphasized that her legacy transcends both her viral audition and the tragedy that later defined her narrative, standing instead as a lasting source of inspiration for millions around the world. Her audition on America's Got Talent remained etched in public memory as one of the most moving in the show's history, not because of flashy production or gimmicks, but because of the pure emotional truth she delivered through her voice. Fans continued to share her performances online, writing messages about how Sydnie gave them the courage to pursue their dreams, to embrace their vulnerabilities, and to find strength in their own struggles, and in this way her influence lived on far beyond the stage. Reporters documented how tribute concerts, online campaigns, and countless social media tributes turned her into a symbol of resilience, authenticity, and the bittersweet reality of chasing dreams in a world that often fails to see the human being behind the artistry. Industry insiders interviewed by journalists admitted that her story forced difficult conversations about how contestants and young artists are treated, sparking discussions that may one day reshape the way fame is managed and supported. Her legacy, reporters concluded, is twofold. She will forever be remembered as the young woman whose voice silenced a room and brought audiences to tears, but also as a figure whose hidden battles challenged the public to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, empathy, and responsibility. In this duality lies the power of her story, one that inspires even in heartbreak, one that ensures her name will not fade from memory, and one that continues to call for a culture where artists are cherished not just for their talent but for their humanity. And so, the heartbreaking true story of Sydnie Christmas that America's Got Talent never fully told is revealed not only through her performances but through the reflections of those who reported on her life. A tale of triumph and tragedy, of a voice that moved millions and a heart that carried burdens unseen. Her journey, as documented by reporters and remembered by fans, reminds us that behind every dazzling moment of television there lies a human story, one filled with complexities, struggles, and truths that applause alone cannot capture. Her legacy endures not only in the unforgettable sound of her singing but in the conversations her story continues to inspire, about empathy, mental health, and the responsibility to see performers as people first. Thank you for watching. Find other interesting videos in our channel's playlist.